To the Point with Michael Williams.
How Florida ignited the heroin epidemic. An extensive, exclusive investigation by the Palm Beach Post into a drug problem that began locally, spread regionally, is now a national one. And we're at the epicenter of it all. You can see part of it in today's paper and more of the series on the Palm Beach Post website. In essence, it says opioids, oxycodone in Florida, led ultimately to a heroin epidemic in this and other states. Good morning and welcome. My guest today, Pat Beall, the lead investigative reporter and writer of this series of reports. And if you've not yet read it, I hope by the end of this broadcast you will take time to do so. It is powerful and disturbing all at the same time. We congratulate you in the sense of unearthing a story that is now receiving national attention and needed it. We appreciate you being our guest.
Well, thank you for asking me.
When you talk about Florida igniting the heroin epidemic, for those who've not read it, first go a little beyond that headline. What's the genesis of the story and of that statement?
Well, I think that we wanted to look at the origins of the heroin epidemic, and we found three players ultimately. And one was Purdue Pharma, whose marketing of OxyContin led to or cultivated an appetite for opioids in the United States. They weren't the only pharmaceutical company that, pushed for opioid consumption, but they were the first and certainly the most aggressive. And the second player was El Chapo, because the Sinaloa cartel saw what many state lawmakers did not, and probably national lawmakers as well. And that's that an appetite for prescription opioids could and would translate at some point to the cheap alternative of heroin.
The Mexican cartel leader, of course, we're speaking of, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who many of you may know. He escaped prison twice, recaptured, made national headlines. But he saw a market. He saw that he was going to be just able to step in and feed an addiction.
And he exploited that. I mean, by about 2008, by one estimate, there were more poppy plantings in Mexico than there were pot plants in Mexico. And so the acreage took off. So when oxycodone was no longer available, suddenly there was a cheap alternative, and Florida was the trigger. I mean, it was almost as though the heroin epidemic was the equivalent of dry tinder, and it only lacked a match, and that was where Florida came in.
And from there, I want to take us back to the beginning of the story. Those are some of the headlines, and by the way, oxycodone derived from poppy, which is the same thing that heroin's derived from. So you see the connection there, and you all talk about that very amply and ably. Take us back to the 90s. Purdue Pharma, we're in a little Virginia town, as your series points out, and suddenly OxyContin becomes the painkiller of choice, and yet time and again as I read the series, you hear about people who were ignoring the addictive nature of it, doctors who were coming on board, the DEA, the Food and Drug Administration, blind to the addictive nature of us. Take us back to the genesis, then we'll bring Florida into how that picture evolved.
Well, in the mid-1990s, there was no doubt that pain was undertreated in the United States, and it was a real concern. And Purdue Pharma had an opportunity with the formulation of OxyContin, which had the strongest amount of oxycodone in pill form that had ever been approved by the FDA for sale at that point. And it's the equivalent, I think one oxycodone can be the equivalent of something like 16 Percocet in terms of its impact and its wallop. But they told the FDA, and the FDA believed that, look, just because it has an awful lot of oxycodone in it, just because there's this really powerfully addictive, drug in it, it's really not going to lead to addiction because we have a time release formula. It's going to slowly release over a period of 12 hours. People aren't going to get an immediate high from it. And then when it starts to wear off, they're not going to get a low. It's going to be smooth, and people no longer have to clock watch for, for pain meds. And that was the selling point. And that's how really the issue of potential addiction was initially addressed.
And I believe in Huntington, Virginia was one town, a lot of workers who were in need of pain meds, a lot of blue-collar workers, some involved in the kind of industries and work that would necessitate need for pain meds. And yet very quickly doctors said there we are seeing that this is becoming addictive and quickly. It was stunning them almost.
Yeah, it really was. I thought one of the more compelling comments that we got was from a nun in Pennington Gap, Virginia.
Yeah.
And she was a recovering alcoholic. She ran an addiction treatment center, and suddenly people are coming in and they're saying, you know, there's this new drug. So she calls a friend of hers who's a pharmacist, and she says, Greg, what are these OCs? What are these oxys? And he says, mark my words, they are advertising these as non-addictive. They are highly addictive. They are going to destroy us. And in fact, Pennington Gap very nearly was destroyed by this epidemic as it came raging through.
The nuance of so much of what you're talking about contained in this superbly well-written series, but we'll fast forward to suddenly OxyContin becomes the rage. Florida has loosely regulated pain med clinics, and suddenly the Oxy Express, as you called it, becomes and finds its ground zero in Palm Beach and Broward counties. And many of you recall this, in excess of 200 plus pill mills. And it wasn't by the hundreds, it was by the tens of thousands that people, both legitimately and illegitimately, were coming here to buy their OxyContin.
Well, we were, you know, we were the genesis, we were the epicenter of the so-called Oxy Express, and van loads of people would travel here, you know, some from the Appalachians, primarily from the Appalachians, and they would just stock up on pills, and then they would travel back across state lines. Some they would use, some of the drugs they would use, some they would sell. So Florida actually was providing, through its almost indifferent attitude toward regulation of pill mills, the raw materials for both trafficking and addiction. And it had been reported previously, you know, that certain states, we call them license tag states, states where cars would show up license tags from Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia. But actually the DEA said it was very much worse than that, that in fact Florida oxycodone and Florida pill mill pills were being trafficked in almost every region east of the Mississippi. And
Florida was the supplier.
And Florida was the supplier of choice, and particularly Palm Beach and Broward counties.
One of the most damning indictments in the series, as I read it, was time and time again, the Food and Drug Administration didn't recognize the risk and the addictive nature. Neither did the Drug Enforcement Administration. Florida lawmakers, as you point out, had 10 years from roughly 2001 to 2011, with more and more evidence mounting to do something about the habit that was forming because of so many people on Oxy, and yet sat on their hands. Talk about that piece of the story, and then that'll bring us to 2011, where finally we clamp down, but create another epidemic in its stead.
In 2001, then Florida Attorney General Bob Butterworth announced an investigation into Purdue Pharma's marketing of OxyContin because there were already reports of overdoses and deaths, and there were real questions about its addictive nature. And at the end of that year, there was an agreement struck, and the agreement worked in part like this. Purdue Pharma agreed to pay up to about $2 million to create a prescription drug monitoring database, which really is the silver bullet to avoid doctor shopping and the kind of pill mill scourge that eventually became routine here in Palm Beach and Broward counties. And all Florida had to do, all the Florida legislature had to do, was just say, okay, we're going to take your money. We're going to make a prescription drug monitoring database. And the legislation was killed as part of a political spat in 2002 and did not get
involving Marco Rubio at the time.
Involving Marco Rubio.
Talk a little more about that.
Well, Rubio at the time was a very powerful member of the state legislature. He was very much involved and invested in a Miami-Dade charter issue that was before the legislature. The primary proponent of the monitoring database, Lockbert, voted against the Miami Charter. And as soon as he did, Rubio killed the prescription drug monitoring database, telling the Miami Herald, it made my decision easy.
There were opportunities then, there would be opportunities in the years that followed. We would see the pill mill problem grow and grow and grow here.
Right.
Rick Scott, when he became governor, at first resistant, as your series of reporting points out, about a prescription drug database, ultimately came around. So we moved to 2011, but by then, as your report points out, from, I believe, 2001 to 2011, some 35,000 Floridians had died because of prescription oxy use.
It wasn't only prescription oxy use, it was a broader prescription drug problem.
But that was part of it.
There were thousands and thousands of people who did in fact die. And so 2011 comes around and we start to do the right thing. We start to crack down. In June, there are new laws that are put into effect, cracking down on pill mills. The prescription drug monitoring database goes live in the last quarter of 2011.
And everybody goes hooray.
And everybody declared victory because they were addressing supply, not demand.
And then you pivot in the reporting that you all did to the fact, and there were examples of this where people said we could almost see from the day that the prescription drug database went into effect, the next day the heroin problem on our streets.
Yeah.
We almost saw it jump instantly. Talk about that, the pivot, and really the addiction that had been created over all these years of inaction by lawmakers, by federal authorities, by doctors who had said it's fine, it's not too addictive, by big pharma. It all came together to create this horrible, ugly stew that turned into the heroin epidemic. Talk about that piece of the story.
Well, Huntington, West Virginia is almost a poster child for what happened because they were on the receiving end of Oxy Express pills forever. And so there were two parts in 2011, two pieces of the crackdown. On June 3rd, Governor Rick Scott signed legislation into effect cracking down on pill mills. The very next day, according to Huntington, West Virginia, they had a heroin problem. They had a pill problem the day before it was signed. They had a heroin problem the day after because remember, El Chapo had seen this coming. The Mexican cartels were already on the street with cheap substitute heroin.
This brings us to the part of the story you talked about at the outset. The drug kingpin from Mexico, El Chapo, as you said, wait a minute, I've got a ready-made market here. And he jumped in and took advantage of it right away.
Yeah, so it was, there was a demand that had never been addressed. And it was as though we, in cracking down on the pill mills, and no one denies that something had to be done, but in cracking down on them and not addressing the need, as James Hall, a well-known Florida epidemiologist said, the need for an opiate molecule on a daily basis. In failing to understand addiction as well as the Mexican cartels understood addiction, we created another problem.
And we've seen the impact of the heroin epidemic on our streets writ large over these last many years. Before we go to break, and we'll talk about it more on the other side of the break, but talk about your biggest takeaways as a reporter, the writer of this series, that of your perspective and of your teams.
Well, I can't speak for the rest of my team, but yeah,
of
course
not
I could, but they might take exception later on. That's right. I think the surprise for me was, just as you said earlier, there were so many points along the way that we could have reined this in. I mean, getting back to the prescription drug monitoring database in 2002, it wasn't just going to be for Florida. The deal was that we would make it available to every other state in the union, and they could be using it. And you have to ask yourself, what if everyone had had that database at that time? What if doctor shopping could have been curbed then instead of many, many years later? And I realize it's, you know, it's a theoretical question, but it's a really important question to ask because we were making choices without looking at the science of addiction, and we're making policy choices now, and you want to make sure that you were informed by the best available science on what addiction is and isn't.
Why were so many buffers, so many backstops, so many fail-safes overwhelmed?
Well, can you give me an example of a fail-safe?
Well, the FDA overwhelmed and said, we don't see the addictive nature of this being perhaps what some worried it would be. The DEA, many argued, didn't see and didn't look deeply enough. Lawmakers didn't look deeply enough. Again and again and again, you saw a huge marketing campaign. And so when I talk fail-safes, talking about there was so much structure out there that you presume would be there that say, aha, let's wait a minute, let's slow down. And yet, as I read the reporting, again and again and again, these off-ramps that might have abated the crisis, nobody seemed to take them for a long, long time, thus creating another crisis.
Right. Well, the DEA is a very interesting case in point because in part because when I spoke with Asa Hutchinson, now governor of Arkansas, who was the head of the DEA in about 2002, 2001, one of the things he said was we were very involved with methamphetamine. We were very worried about that drug at that point in time. But it's absolutely clear that the DEA was under incredible pressure, not only by doctors, but by states' attorneys in 30 states who said, please do not crack down on opioid prescribing because our citizens deserve the best relief possible. And what's extraordinary about that written statement is some of the states' attorneys who were signing on it were from states where oxycodone, even then, was burning through their state and their communities.
We'll pick up this discussion on the other side of the break. Please stay with us. Coming up, we'll talk more about this story, where it took them, and the reporting behind these stories, and the obstacles the reporters faced.